think that means it's working. So I proposed this session because, in our field, we have a lot of talk about how we need to adapt to all these new developments, but not enough serious discussion about the potential consequences of using AI. So I want to start a discussion about what that means for us collectively in our professional areas. So I will talk about that from a couple different angles today. What AI means for the quality of our work as responsible professionals who want to leave the world better than we found it. And we'll talk about what AI means for us as workers trying to make a living and who are affected by these changes in the industry. And I will also tell you the true meaning of the word "limit." So we've already started discussing concerns. We'll continue that in a moment. And then I'm going to take the bulk of the time to share some perspectives on potential consequences for creative professions in particular. And by creative professions, I mean both designers and developers. Personally, I'm coming to this topic with a background in human-centered design and user experience. So there will be a bit of a bias towards a design focus. I'm an independent consultant. This is a topic I study in my spare time. And I'm sharing my thinking so far in the hope that it can develop as a conversation, but it's certainly a work in progress. So one thing that makes it especially difficult to discuss the impacts of AI is that there's so much hype. By the way, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So a lot of this is driven by corporate propaganda. We're hearing AI is going to be transformative. It's the next industrial revolution. Our jobs will be completely unrecognizable in a few years, and it's all inevitable. So we better get on board. And on the other hand, there's been a backlash. AI is snake oil. It's a worthless bubble that's about to collapse. But both the hype and the backlash can cloud this discussion. They make it difficult to seriously evaluate the claims people are making about what AI can do. And when we say AI, that's really a broad range of technologies that can't all be placed in the same bucket. It's a marketing term. So we need to get really, really specific. So what technology are we talking about? What are the use cases? And only then can we evaluate, what are the benefits and harms of this tool in this particular use case. So let's talk about the scenario for a minute. Let's imagine that a new startup is selling a Gen AI-based product that will help corporate leaders plan technology missions. So this could be marketing director, IT director, or something else. The way it works is the leader will enter a description of their initiative and its goal. The tool will ask follow-up questions to gather details like project requirements, timeline. The tool will produce a recommended technical solution, including architecture diagrams and user stories. And this is trained on a corpus of documents gathered from different organizations. And it will also output an estimated budget range and staffing plan so that the project can be approved, and then they can hire those people and implement the project. So what are the potential ramifications of this tool? You're just going to get two or three answers.
There's no checks and balances for whether or not it's correct.
Okay, no checks and balances for whether or not it's correct.
Relevance for positions. I'm a project manager. This is going to do a lot of my work.
So it's going to do a lot of your work, take your place as a project manager?
Yes.
I was going to say they'll lay off all their UX people.
They'll lay off UX people, okay, and probably more than UX people, right?
It's funny because I was going to say it's missing the user research, the user.
Yes.
research. Yeah. So you could do this, invest the money, and have it fail because you didn't. It's all stakeholder.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Yes, I know user involvement here. It's all shaped by stakeholder assumptions.
And the AI is programmed to give you the answer you want to hear, like
Yeah.
a plausible answer that you will accept.
Yeah. So confirmation bias.
Confirmation.
Yeah. So we covered some important things. One other thing I'll add is that going through planning processes like this as a team are a really important driver of organizational learning. And it's an opportunity to build alignment. So you're potentially removing opportunities for that to take place. Okay, so let's talk about resisting AI. When I say resisting AI, I don't mean we're going to automatically reject all forms of advanced computing. I do mean that we can resist specific uses of computing that we think are harmful to us as workers or harmful to our organizations or society more broadly. It does mean taking a position against some uses of AI. And there are lots of reasons to do so. Machine learning and Gen AI have been implicated in all kinds of problems, from disinformation in politics to discrimination in law enforcement and healthcare and education. The area I'm going to focus on right now is the impact of AI on work, and particularly generative AI, but not exclusively. When we talk about AI and work, this often brings up certain narratives that we hear often. So some examples are, and these are narratives about automation. So the idea that automation will remove drudgery from work, it will lead to economic growth and prosperity, even if it causes short-term unemployment. That's just short-term. We'll adapt and they'll be better off for it. And the terms of this debate are set by industry. This is very self-serving and it's self-fulfilling. Tech companies convince us that we have no choice but to adopt the technology. That it's an inevitable form of social progress. But in fact, it's not necessarily progress when we talk about automation. Automation can help or hurt the economy depending on how industries implement it. And there are, many historical examples on either side of that. Automation still depends on large amounts of hidden labor, people doing more machine-like work in difficult conditions for lower pay. It can enable concentration of economic power, and this sort of the consequences for people are not necessarily short-term. We know that inequality is or can be intergenerational. Another response that comes back is, well, AI won't replace people. So we have this idea of AI will augment people. We have human in the loop. Humans will always be there to guide and supervise the technology. It will make people smarter, more efficient, more productive. Now, one reason to be skeptical of this is that tech companies are literally telling us that they do want to replace workers. Right, so we see this from Microsoft, IBM, other big tech companies, and they're saying it proudly. At the same time, so I think I missed. Oh, out of order. Okay, so businesses do want to save on labor costs, whether that's by fully or only partially automating certain functions. There's the potential for de-skilling, which is when skilled jobs get replaced with less skilled jobs, so there's no longer a use for your skills, or potentially now you're competing for a smaller number of lower paid opportunities. So this can still concentrate wealth. It can decrease worker autonomy, shift decision-making power to business owners. So we still need to think about how it changes the nature of our work when we have more automation in the workplace. And then at the same time, human-machine interaction hasn't always led to the expected benefits. There's the issue of automation bias, which is when people have a tendency to accept the outcomes or the decisions made by automated tools, even if it's more likely to be wrong, even if they know they need to expect the answers. It's difficult to do that. We'll talk more about how it can displace other practices that are part of the work. And it doesn't even necessarily reduce workload. So, okay, this is all a little abstract. So now I want to apply these ideas to design and engineering. Any quick clarifications needed before I go in? Okay. So I'm going to dive deeper into two aspects of this. First, I'll talk about the consequences of using AI as a design tool, and then I'll come back to the questions of labor and employment. So with the emergence of generative AI, the big question is AI actually capable of doing design? And when I say the word design, another way of thinking about that is creative problem solving, regardless of the specific discipline. And in order to answer this, we kind of have to ask, well, what is design? What would a computer have to do in order to be able to solve design and engineering problems? And this takes us back to the 1960s. So this will be a really fast history lesson. In the 60s, the design methods movement was a series of conferences and academic publications on design methodology. So this was a group of designers, architects, and engineers who, in this post-war period, were interested in using design methodology to solve increasingly complex problems that involve both technical and social dimensions. So we can think of anything from like designing an airplane to city planning, which is a heavily social process. And there was a guiding belief at the time that design could be turned into a science. And if you can turn it into a science, science can solve these kinds of complex problems. There were attempts to formulate a single rationalized method for design, a general purpose methodology that you could apply to any problem. And there was even a desire to automate design with computers. So this was the beginning of the first wave of AI hype. And they were thinking, okay, maybe we can design systems that will do this complex kind of design. So this is what I mean by systematic methods. And this is the origin of the kinds of process models that we commonly see in engineering today. By the 1970s, computing and automation are in wide usage in many areas of engineering and architecture. So think about things like designing algorithms to design integrated circuits with thousands of logic gates. There's also a great deal of development in expert systems. Expert systems were like AI applications capable of going through reasoning processes in order to make complex decisions, the way a human expert would. And ultimately, expert systems for design were seen as a failure. So these systems did work in very extremely well-defined, narrowly defined domains, but they didn't work in situations where problems are ambiguous. So you need to be able to define a problem very clearly up front, define your criteria of success, define the knowledge that you need to use in a structured way in order to make decisions. And the essence of a design problem, especially in a social domain like city planning or law, is that the problem is ambiguous and it can never be defined fully. You need to go through the entire process. You really need to arrive at a solution before you really know what the problem is. And even then, you've only arrived at one interpretation of the problem. So meanwhile, while all this is happening in the world of design scholarship, there's a backlash against design methods for a number of reasons. Key figures in the movement like Christopher Alexander and John Price Jones repudiated the idea that design could be reduced to a set of rules to follow. And the field shifted away from methodology and towards studies of designer behavior. So how do designers actually work and apply their expertise? So coming out of design studies, there's an appreciation that design relies on intuitive processes just as much as rational ones. So things like sense making, imagination, improvisation, abductive thinking, the idea that you need to reframe a problem over and over again to go through the process, applying subjective like value judgments, aesthetic judgments. And when it comes to AI, the focus shifts to AI as a tool that can support designers instead of automating design. So I'm going to skip over this, but the point is that I've been trying to unpack this and explore what are all the ways in which people have talked about computers as a tool that supports design and creative problem solving. But I'm going to skip ahead and just talk about a few different use cases and some of the risks that we might want to be thinking about. And there's certainly tons of potential for AI-driven tools to support design work. I don't argue with that. So again, I'm just going to cover a few different examples. So the first is that current tools, especially deep learning based tools, foundation models, these are built on heavily biased data sets that were not built for the purpose we're using them for. One example, a recent study found that UI designs generated by ChatGPT incorporated deceptive design patterns without being asked. These are design patterns that are known to manipulate users, but they're widespread on the internet. So they come up in these outputs. Earlier, I mentioned this idea of automation bias, where people have a tendency to accept the outputs from an AI tool, even though they know they need to check for inaccuracies and biases and issues. And there's just no possible way we can expect everybody to uncover all of these issues. So imagine this kind of tool being used at a large scale. So even if the designer knows, or the user knows that the design is just meant as a starting place, this is likely to perpetuate the use of these deceptive patterns more often than not. And if it's not deceptive patterns, which are pretty overt, it could be something more subtle, like design patterns that are not culturally appropriate, aspects of corporate websites being incorporated into the website of a school or a government agency. So there are much more subtle biases that come when you're using a tool that's just trained on the internet. And this also points to a broader problem. So this is a second issue, and it's that deep learning models do not have the ability to break from the past. So the context in which we work is changing. So we think about sort of the PESTLE or PEST acronym, like political, environmental, social, technological, legal aspects of the environment are always changing. And this demands new solutions that can't be produced by just training on and reproducing existing data. So moving on. A lot has been said about synthetic users. There's some really good blog posts on this. I'm not going to rehash those. The claims that vendors are making in the data sets that they're using to create tools like this. So basically, they said you're going to interact with a chatbot who's going to simulate human beings. These claims are just hugely problematic and misleading. Even if you're just using it as a starting place. But the one thing I want to add, and this goes back to your point earlier, is that the point of user research is that you're engaging the people who are impacted by the decisions you make. Is to build an understanding of your audience and hopefully make sure they have a voice in business decisions. Synthetic users does not accomplish this. It creates distance between you and your audiences. And this ties into another theme. So this was a study by a group of researchers at Harvard and Microsoft looking at users, 200,000 developers using GitHub Copilot over 2 years. And they conclude that now I'll preface this by saying I think there are good reasons to be skeptical of how they like used their data to reach these conclusions, but I'm just going to take them at their word, which is that the use of Copilot led to workers substituting away from work patterns that rely on others to solve coding issues, and instead using Copilot in place of human capital required in the previous interactions. It reduces the number of peers they collaborate with dramatically. Copilot, so it's reducing collaboration, and this change is seen more with developers of lower ability, so less experienced developers, than with more experienced developers. And their main focus here is that they view this as an increase in efficiency. If I can solve a problem in code without having to interact with another team member, that's more efficient. So, okay, so I understand how valuable it is if Copilot can help solve a problem that that a developer can't solve, couldn't otherwise solve on their own. Like there's tremendous value in that. But this change, if it's as dramatic as they say it is also concerning, because working with other people is the main way in which we learn and improve the quality of our work. And it's also what makes work meaningful. There was a really important study. So Matthew Bean studies skill development. And in this research, he looked at surgeons training to use robotic surgery. And what he found was that in traditional surgery, surgeons learn by working together, doing hands-on work, and sort of slowly increasing the difficulty of the task they're taking on. But because of the configuration of sort of you're working at a computer terminal to control a robot, that sort of foreclosed those traditional ways of learning and training surgeons. So this is a huge concern. If we need to keep training medical professionals, and this applies in many different professions. So this is a concern when we're talking about anytime we're talking about going from something that's collaborative to something that you do by yourself. Okay, and then the last point in this section is I'm sure you've heard about how even just one ChatGPT query can be extremely resource intensive in terms of energy and water usage. So you've heard of like doing a query that's this long is like pouring out a bottle of water. For almost anything we can do with Gen AI, there's some way of doing it without Gen AI. So we need to think about whether the benefits of choosing Gen AI outweigh the environmental costs. And this is a really hard calculation to make. Forecasts say that we'll have hundreds of millions of climate refugees by the middle of the century, and large swaths of populated areas will become too hot to be habitable in the world. So meanwhile, the demand for more and bigger data centers has revitalized coal-powered energy plants that otherwise would have been taken offline. It's consuming huge amounts of water in areas where we're facing risk of ecosystem collapse. It depends on raw materials that are incredibly polluting to mine. In some places that have children working under subhuman conditions to mine the metals used in electronics. So I don't mean to be super dark, but like there's a much bigger picture here than just like how much energy are we using to do these tasks. And when we talk about design, I bring this back to the tradition of social design, where innovation is motivated by social and environmental issues. So it's not good design if we create a great product, but it's at the expense of this bigger picture. Tech CEOs are saying, with no evidence, that AI will solve climate change. But we can't solve these problems without collaboration, without deep pluralistic dialogue and creative thinking about the worlds that we want to bring into being. I'm not just talking about creativity because it feels good and it's sort of because I'm sentimental about creativity, but because it's necessary. You know, we can't accomplish these things with synthetic conversations and generative models trained on past technology. Okay, so the next section hopefully will be a little bit more hopeful. Even if we can solve all the problems of automation bias and skill development with AI, we still also want to consider how it will impact workers. Again, just checking in. Any quick clarifications, questions before I keep going? Okay. All right. So now, another history lesson. I'm going to bring us back to one of the first times we had machines replacing skilled labor on a large scale, and that was, of course, the original Industrial Revolution. Excuse me a second. Okay. So the story I'm about to tell comes from this fantastic book, Blood in the Machine. It's an incredibly engaging retelling of the story of the Luddites that draws parallels to contemporary industry, draws parallels to big tech and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, all that stuff throughout the retelling of this history from 200 years ago. So I highly recommend the book. The story is focused on the English Midlands, where for hundreds of years there was a thriving industry producing textiles and clothing made from wool, and later on cotton. This included men and women working in their homes or in small shops in a wide variety of skilled roles. By the late 1700s, it was common for these craftspeople to be using fairly complex hand-powered machines. So it's not that there had never been backlashes against machines before, there certainly were. But for the most part, that technology development had been slow and the industry was relatively stable. Craftspeople made a good living using machines that they owned or shared. Then in the late 1700s into the 1800s, there was a steady stream of development of new machinery, bolstered by water, steam, and coal power, which allowed yarn, cloth, and finished goods to be produced at a larger scale. So one earlier example of this is the spinning jenny for spinning yarn or thread. And what this did was this hand crank machine, and one person could do what it would previously take 6 people to do. Later that increased by orders of magnitude, and then was combined with water and steam power. At the same time, industrialists and entrepreneurs were developing these technologies, were using them to build water and steam powered factories. This machinery resulted in goods of inferior quality, but it allowed entrepreneurs to create those goods at much higher volumes with fewer workers, and those workers did not need the years of training and apprenticeship that independent craftspeople went through. Entrepreneurs were able to undercut or even monopolize the market. Factories put people to work for low pay in extremely dangerous conditions, and there was even a practice of bringing in orphans as young as 6 years old for indentured apprenticeships in these very dangerous conditions. This didn't only affect workers in factories. The business people who employed skilled laborers in other places were able to slash wages. Some workers had to rent their equipment from entrepreneurs who took increasing percentages of their earnings. There were peaceful attempts by workers to organize, negotiate better wages with business owners, and even lobby parliament to enforce existing laws, which would have made conditions better. But for the most part, the laws were not enforced. And then the situation became more dire. After England declared war on France, there was a fear among the political elites that there would be a domestic revolution. So they banned political organizing, all forms of organizing, including workers' unions. So workers could not unionize, even though businessmen were actively colluding to cut wages. The crown levied heavy taxes to pay for the war, and at the same time, they imposed trade sanctions that cut off export markets for the textile industry. Combined with the growing industrialization, this created a huge economic crisis. People were out of work. Many were going hungry at a time of lavish spending by an out-of-touch monarch. And that is when the Luddite uprising began. This wasn't the first time workers had revolted by destroying machinery or burning down a factory, but this accelerated from the years of 1811 to 1813. And this became a widespread movement. So this is what would happen. A letter would be posted in town warning that a certain business would be attacked unless the owner gave into demands such as increasing wages or stopping the use of a certain machinery. If the owner gave into the demands, they would be spared. If not, a group of workers would gather at night at a secret location, bringing their hammers and axes and other weapons. They were highly organized. They didn't use names. The leader of the group would always be called General Ludd or King Ludd, Ludd. And then they would march down to the factory, break the door down, and destroy the machines. This happened again and again. As news spread, the machine breaking spread to different towns and manufacturing centers across the Midlands. This method allowed for the movement to grow in a way that was secretive and highly organized, but also decentralized without any top-down leadership. It's important to realize that these workers were not against technology. These are skilled workers who used machines themselves, but they had their livelihoods taken away. Their communities were starving. They weren't against technology. They were against the business practices. They were against business owners taking their livelihoods and destroying their communities. This was not some small group of people who were outside of the mainstream. They were massively popular. They were in every town. Workers and all kinds of professions joined the cause. At its peak, machine breaking was happening every night. People in communities protected them by refusing to give information to the authorities. They inspired folk songs. This was a true uprising. So why are we taught that it's bad to be a Luddite? The political and industrial elite immediately responded to this by trying to control the enthusiasm for machine breaking. They propagated the idea that Luddites are mindless sheep who hated machinery and were too dumb to, quote, too dumb to see that automation was for everyone's benefit in the long run. Manufacturers had a lot of political power backed by Parliament. And this was a time when there was a great deal of interest in laissez-faire capitalism, deregulation. They were convinced by the writing of Adam Smith and other economists who advanced the ideas that technology and industrialization will lead to prosperity by increasing production and demand, and the idea that automation will create as many jobs as it displaces. Okay, sounds familiar? These ideas go back hundreds of years, and they've been repeated over and over and over again. All throughout the 20th century, there are examples in the rhetoric of CEOs using the word Luddite as shorthand for someone who blindly opposes technology and, importantly, is doomed and at least a little dumb. That, again, Brian Merchant put. So both today and back then, politicians and businessmen profited immensely from the ideas of laissez-faire and free trade. So the aristocracy did not recognize a working class movement that was demanding political change. Instead, their view was that the machines needed to be protected. So what happened? Ultimately, authorities took an escalating set of steps to suppress the uprising. They made machine breaking into a capital offense. They sent in spies. They started sending in troops to protect factories. In 1812, the Home Secretary sent in a large force to occupy Nottingham in the Midlands to suppress the uprising altogether. They set up artillery and industrial centers in each city. They marched through the towns. They rounded up suspected Luddites and interrogated them. The total force, including military and local militias, totaled 35,000 troops occupying this region of the country. That was about the size of the population of the city of Nottingham itself. So this is a huge occupation of the region. Okay, so there's more to the story. I could go on, but and they, at first this doesn't work. They the Luddites protect each other, and they keep the machine breaking keeps happening. But eventually, the government basically wins and gets the uprising to end. Even though the Luddites did have some wins along the way. So Brian Merchant goes on to talk about big tech today, the parallels between the industrialists in this period of England and the tech billionaires we know today, and the similarities are just uncanny. He talks about gig workers like Uber drivers, factory workers at Amazon, who are subject to relentless algorithmic optimization, making their working conditions and their pay worse. He talks about the legacy of the Luddites. They did have some victories. They influenced the next generation of protesters and reformers. They helped many different workers view themselves as a class with linked interests, and they imparted tactics to future rebels. In another great book, Gavin Mueller talks about the Luddites as part of a 250-year history of sabotage as a mode of resistance against poor working conditions. Okay. So there's a lot unresolved there about how, what we do with that, but I'm gonna wrap this up for the time being. We're being told today that we need to learn to work with AI and learn how to build products that use AI. We're being asked to, in some cases, automate and de-skill our work, and in some cases help automate, de-skill the work of others. And I think this applies in some areas of software more than others, but is especially relevant for enterprise and workplace software. The growing discourse for UX designers is that we need to learn to design human AI interactions so that AI can be more effective and more appealing for customers to interact with a bot. And I'm not saying there aren't situations where this isn't important. It absolutely is. But it also makes me think about the way designers in the early to mid 20th century helped to make plastic appealing as a material for consumer products. Now we have a crisis of plastic pollution where we have nanoplastic particles in our waterways and air, our bodies, the digestive systems of animals at all levels of the food web. So microplastics and nanoplastics might not have been predictable in 1940, but today we can anticipate some of the externalities of our work. We cannot sustain a fully automated economy. It's just not, it's not plausible. We cannot sustain the inequality that large-scale AI perpetuates. I'm going to wrap up with a few quick quotes from Resisting AI by Dan McQuillan. McQuillan argues that AI is an arrangement of technologies, institutions, and ideologies, has tendencies towards fascism. That doesn't mean that everyone who uses or builds an AI product is a fascist, or that it will lead to fascism in and of itself. But what it does mean is that when states and other large institutions use AI to automate, to manage their interactions with people, to make decisions, it has a tendency to enable and normalize fascistic responses to social problems. And this sort of gets into a lot of bunch of different case studies of governments using AI. He says that AI is a brittle and opaque form of statistical reasoning that reinforces social inequality. Talking about the resources it takes to train AI models, he says the unrelenting demand for ever greater quantities of training data has sent existing mechanisms of data capture into overdrive. So, in other words, it incentivizes surveillance. It relies on fundamentally extractive and exploitative systems of labor. In order for AI to be used to make decisions about how to operate businesses or government services, it operates as a tool for social categorization. It opens up opportunities for unaccountable decisions, unjust exclusions, and exploitative speculations. And finally, its statistical fragility ends up hurting the less privileged. It ends up reflecting structural inequality in the institutions that control it. The tendencies of AI demand that we approach AI as a matter of care. It requires mutual support, solidarity, and self-organization among workers to counter the harmfulness of AI. Ultimately, this requires not only refusing certain forms of AI, but restructuring the conditions that give rise to AI in the first place and building new institutional arrangements that better align with the common good. So, some of you may already be involved in some form of worker organizing. Others may be unsure how I feel about AI. Is resistance justified? Is it even possible? Is it safe? But I'm leaving you with these stories as a reminder that we've been here before. Technology can have good consequences or bad ones, depending on the people and institutions who use it. And we can only shape this future if we do it through collective power. So that's it. Thank you. I'm sorry we don't have time for questions. So went a little bit over, but I'll love to continue the conversation out in the hallway if you have time. So thank you so much.
That was a good kind of,
Good kind of what?
that was a good kind of,
Good kind
bummer.
of bummer. Okay. How did this make you feel? Are you just bummed out? Was there anything that energized you? Oh, I gotta stop the recording.